The charity gala at the Grand Plaza Hotel glittered with wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the ballroom where the city's elite mingled, their jewelry catching the light with every gesture. In the kitchen, away from the sparkle and champagne, Elena Ramirez retied her apron and took a deep breath. 2 more hours, she whispered to herself, flexing her tired feet inside her sensible black shoes. At 28, Elena had mastered the art of the service smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes but satisfied the wealthy patrons who barely glanced her way. Tonight was important. The event coordinator had made that clear enough. "These people donate millions," he'd said during the pre-shift briefing. "Don't spill, don't speak unless spoken to. And for heaven's sake, don't forget which guest gets the dairy-free option." Elena checked her watch. She'd been on her feet for nearly 10 hours already, having come straight from her morning shift at the diner. The double shifts were killing her, but her grandmother's medical bills weren't paying themselves. "Table 7 needs champagne refills," called Miguel, another server who'd been kind enough to show her the ropes when she'd started at the hotel 3 months ago. Elena nodded, loaded her tray with flutes of champagne, and pushed through the swinging doors into the ballroom. She moved with natural grace between tables, something she'd retained from years of piano training, though those days felt like they belonged to someone else now. "Champagne, sir?" she asked, offering the tray to a gray-haired man who nodded without looking at her. This was how it went. She was part of the backdrop, like the flowers or the music that was supposed to be playing. Elena glanced at the empty piano in the corner of the room. The pianist was late, or maybe not coming at all. The event coordinator looked increasingly frantic, checking his phone every few seconds. As Elena weaved between tables, she caught snippets of conversation, business deals, vacation homes, stock portfolios. A world away from her tiny apartment where she'd left her grandmother sleeping, medicine bottles lined up on the nightstand. She approached table 9, supposedly the most important guests of the evening. The hotel manager himself had pointed them out during the briefing. Leading the table was Richard Blackwell, tech billionaire and infamous perfectionist. His company, Horizon Technologies, was rumored to be working on something revolutionary, though the details were kept under strict secrecy. Champagne, Elena offered, careful to approach from the left as she'd been trained. Richard Blackwell didn't respond immediately. Unlike the other guests who looked through her, he was watching her with unusual intensity. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe early 40s, with dark hair showing touches of silver at the temples. His tailored suit probably cost more than 6 months of her rent. "Thank you," he said finally, taking a glass. As she tilted the tray toward him, her sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing the delicate piano key tattoo on her inner wrist, a reminder of the life she'd left behind. His eyes caught the tattoo, and something shifted in his expression. Elena quickly adjusted her sleeve and moved on to the next guest, but she could feel his gaze following her, across the room. The event coordinator was now in a full-blown panic, having a hushed but intense conversation on his phone. Elena overheard him as she passed. "What do you mean he's not coming? We have 200 guests and a silent auction for the children's hospital. We need music." Elena kept her head down and continued working. Not her problem. She had enough to worry about, like how she was going to pay this month's rent after covering her grandmother's latest treatment. The room was growing restless. The subtle background music from the speakers wasn't enough to mask the tension. Elena noticed a particularly stern-looking man at Blackwell's table leaning in to speak with him. Their conversation didn't look friendly. "That's Lawrence Chen," whispered Miguel as they crossed paths near the kitchen. "Major investor. Word is he's threatening to pull out of Blackwell's new project." Elena nodded, though she didn't fully understand the significance. All these wealthy power plays seemed distant from her reality of counting tips and cutting coupons. She returned to the kitchen to pick up another tray of drinks when the event coordinator intercepted. "You. What's your name again?" "Elena, sir." "Elena, do any of the staff play piano? Our pianist had a family emergency and we need anyone, who can play something suitable for the next 30 minutes until we find a replacement." She hesitated, an old instinct telling her to keep that part of herself hidden. "I don't think so, sir. Maybe check with the bartenders?" He hurried away, desperation clear on his face. Elena felt a twinge of guilt but pushed it aside. She hadn't touched a piano in 3 years, not since the disaster at the regional competition that had ended her dreams of a music scholarship. When she returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had deteriorated further. Conversations were strained, and several guests were checking their watches or phones. The empty piano stood like an accusation in the corner. As she served dessert to a table of jewelry-draped women, Elena found herself humming softly, an old habit when she was stressed. It was a Bach piece, one of the more challenging preludes she'd mastered years ago. "You have a good ear," said a voice behind her. Elena turned to find Richard Blackwell standing there, his champagne glass empty. Up close, his presence was even more commanding, but there was something shrewd in his eyes that made her uneasy. "Thank you, sir. Would you like another drink?" "What I'd like," he said, lowering his voice, "is to know why someone who hums Bach preludes perfectly in tune is serving drinks instead of playing that piano." Elena's heart skipped. "I don't play anymore, sir. That tattoo on your wrist suggests otherwise." She instinctively covered her wrist with her other hand. "It's from another life." He studied her face. "Your name?" "Elena Ramirez." Recognition flickered in his eyes. "Elena Ramirez. Weren't you the young pianist who—" "I need to get back to work," she interrupted, not wanting to hear the rest of that sentence, not wanting to be reminded of how she'd frozen on stage, how her fingers had betrayed her at the worst possible moment. Before she could escape, the event coordinator appeared at Blackwell's side, looking frantic. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm so sorry about the music situation. We're trying to find a replacement, but it might be—" "I believe I found your pianist," Blackwell interrupted, gesturing to Elena. The color drained from her face. "No, there's been a misunderstanding. I don't play. That's not what your fingers were saying while you were humming Bach." There was a hint of challenge in Blackwell's voice. The event coordinator looked between them, hope dawning on his face. "You play piano? That's wonderful. Please, we're desperate." "I can't," Elena said firmly. "I haven't played in years. 3 years to be exact," Blackwell said, "since the Pacific Northwest competition." The fact that he knew this unsettled her. "Sir, I need to serve these desserts." At that moment, the stern-looking investor, Lawrence Chen, approached. "Richard, I need a word. I'm not sure this event is worth my time anymore." His eyes darted around the room. No music, disorganized service. If this is an indication of how Horizon Technologies is run— Blackwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Elena recognized the look of someone seeing a carefully constructed plan falling apart. "Give me 5 minutes, Lawrence," Blackwell said smoothly. "I'm about to solve our entertainment problem." Chen raised an eyebrow but stepped away. Blackwell turned back to Elena, his voice lower and more urgent. "Look, I don't know why you stopped playing, and frankly, I don't care. But I need that room settled, and based on what I just heard, you can help. I'm sorry, but your grandmother is Rosa Ramirez, correct? Currently undergoing treatment for stage 3 pancreatic cancer?" Elena froze. "How do you know that?" Blackwell shrugged. "I make it my business to know things. Hospital bills must be substantial." "That's none of your business," she whispered, anger rising beneath her fear. "I'm making it my business. Play one song, just one, and I'll cover your grandmother's medical expenses. All of them." Elena stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "You can't be serious." "I'm always serious about transactions, Ms. Ramirez. One song for your grandmother's care. Or you can refuse and continue struggling with double shifts and mounting debt." He glanced at the event coordinator. "I assume this young lady would also lose her position if she refuses to help in this emergency situation." The coordinator sputtered. "Well, I mean, we're a team here, and in emergencies—" "That's what I thought," Blackwell said. He turned back to Elena. "So what will it be? One song or your job and your grandmother's treatment?" Elena felt trapped, cornered by this man who'd somehow uncovered her most private struggles and greatest fear in the span of a conversation. The rational part of her brain screamed that this was manipulation, that she should walk away. But the image of her grandmother's face, lined with pain even while sleeping, flashed before her eyes. "One song," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Blackwell smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Excellent choice." As the event coordinator practically dragged her toward the grand piano in the corner, Elena felt a strange detachment, as if she were watching herself from a distance. 3 years. It had been 3 years since she'd sat before keys like these, since her fingers had betrayed her when it mattered most. And now, with the weight of her grandmother's future and 200 judging eyes upon her, She was about to face that moment again. Elena stared at the gleaming grand piano as if it were a living thing waiting to devour her. The glossy black surface reflected the chandelier lights, almost mocking her with its beauty. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the event coordinator guided her through the now silent crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with forced cheer, while our scheduled pianist was unavoidably detained. "We're fortunate to have discovered exceptional talent among our staff tonight. Please welcome Elena Ramirez." A smattering of polite applause followed. Elena could feel 200 pairs of eyes on her, but none burned quite like Richard Blackwell's calculating gaze from table 9. Next to him, Lawrence Chen checked his watch impatiently. Elena smoothed her server's uniform, suddenly painfully aware of how out of place she looked beside the magnificent instrument. The last time she'd performed publicly had been in a blue gown her grandmother had sewn by hand, spending money they didn't have on fabric that shimmered under stage lights. That day had ended in disaster, her fingers freezing mid-sonata, the crushing silence of the auditorium, the scholarship committee's disappointed faces. She'd walked off stage and never returned until now. As she lowered herself onto the bench, memories flooded back. The countless hours of practice, her grandmother's gentle encouragement even when arthritis gnarled her own once nimble fingers, the dreams they'd built together, crumbling in an instant of paralyzing fear. Elena raised her hands to the keys and found them trembling violently. She placed them in her lap instead, taking a deep breath. From across the room, Blackwell watched her struggle, his expression unreadable. He raised his champagne glass slightly, a silent reminder of their deal. All she needed to do was play one song successfully, and her grandmother's medical bills would be covered. One song to undo years of failure. One song to save the person who had sacrificed everything for her. Yet her fingers wouldn't move. A few awkward coughs broke the silence. Someone whispered. Elena felt sweat beating at her temples despite the room's perfect temperature. The familiar panic began to rise, the tightness in her chest, the tunnel vision narrowing until all she could see were the keys, blurring before her eyes. She heard the event coordinator shift nervously behind her. "Perhaps another staff member," he began quietly. "She'll play," came Blackwell's voice, closer than she expected. He had risen from his table and now stood near the piano, hands clasped behind his back. "Won't you, Ms. Ramirez?" Elena looked up at him, anger flashing through her fear. "You don't understand," she whispered fiercely. "I can't. This was a mistake. Your grandmother's treatment costs approximately $12,000 per month," Blackwell said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Experimental therapies that insurance won't cover." I checked. Elena's hands balled into fists. "Why are you doing this? Why me?" For a brief moment, something genuine flickered across his face. "Because 3 years ago I was in the audience at the Pacific Northwest competition. I heard what you were capable of before." He hesitated. "Before whatever happened, happened." Elena stared at him in disbelief. "You were there?" He nodded once curtly. "I sponsor the arts foundation that organized it. Your Bach interpretation was memorable." He glanced over at Lawrence Chen, who was now in conversation with another investor, both looking increasingly displeased. "I need to save this evening and you need to save your grandmother. Seems like a simple transaction to me." "And if I fail?" Elena asked, the question barely audible. Blackwell's expression hardened again. "Then I've misjudged you and we both lose. But I rarely misjudge talent." He stepped back, rejoining the crowd that watched with waning patience. Elena turned back to the piano. The ivory keys waited, neutral and innocent. They weren't her enemy. The music wasn't her enemy. Only fear. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper in her ear. "Music comes from the heart, Nina, not from the fingers." With shaking hands, Elena positioned her fingers over the keys. She closed her eyes and played the opening notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the piece she'd practiced more than any other, the one that lived in her muscle memory. The first notes came out hesitant and stiff. Wrong. All wrong. Her left hand missed a note, creating a dissonant sound that made her wince. She stopped abruptly, the unfinished phrase hanging awkwardly in the air. A few uncomfortable glances were exchanged among the guests. Lawrence Chen leaned over to Blackwell, saying something that made the billionaire's jaw tighten. Elena could feel the opportunity, For her grandmother, for herself, slipping away. She started again, forcing her rigid fingers to press the keys. The notes came out technically correct but lifeless, mechanical. She had once played with passion that moved listeners to tears. Now she was just pressing keys in the right order, her body tense with anxiety. Halfway through the first movement, her right hand cramped painfully, unused to the stretches required after years away from the instrument. She faltered again, hitting a jarring wrong note that echoed through the silent ballroom. Someone near the back stood up and headed for the exit. Then another. The room was losing interest, losing patience. Elena felt the familiar sensation of her chest constricting, her vision tunneling until the keys before her seemed impossibly distant. She stopped playing, her breath coming in short gasps. The silence that followed was deafening. "I told you this was a waste of time," she heard Lawrence Chen say to Blackwell, not bothering to keep his voice down. "Just like your entire neural interface project. Grand ideas with no execution." He stood up, gathering his coat. "I'm pulling my investment. Call me when you've found some actual talent, musical or otherwise." Several other investors at the table exchanged glances and began gathering their things. Elena stared at the keys, mortified. She'd just cost Blackwell whatever business deal he'd been working on. She'd failed her grandmother. Again, she should have known better than to try. Some broken things couldn't be fixed. As she started to stand ready to flee the humiliating scene, a small object fell from the pocket of her uniform. The locket her grandmother had given her on her 16th birthday clattered onto the piano bench. It had sprung open, revealing the tiny photograph inside. Elena, at age 7, sitting at their old upright piano, her grandmother's hands gently guiding hers. Elena picked it up, her thumb brushing over the image. She remembered that day. She'd been struggling with a simple piece, frustrated to the point of tears. Her grandmother hadn't scolded or pushed. Instead, she'd said something Elena had forgotten until this very moment. "Don't play for others, Nina. Play for yourself. Play for joy." Across the room, Blackwell was now standing, attempting to salvage the situation with Chen and the other departing investors. His composed facade had cracked, revealing genuine alarm as his carefully orchestrated evening collapsed. Elena looked down at the photograph once more. Then, almost without conscious thought, her fingers returned to the keys. But this time she didn't attempt the Beethoven sonata. Instead, her fingers found the simple melody her grandmother had taught her first, a folk song from her childhood in a small mountain village. It wasn't complex or impressive, just pure and true. Her fingers remembered. They moved without hesitation now, the notes flowing like water. Elena closed her eyes and played not for the wealthy audience, not for Blackwell's business deal, not even for her grandmother's medical bills. She played for the joy of it, for the memory of her grandmother's hands guiding hers, for the love that had always accompanied music in their small apartment, filled with second-hand furniture and first-rate dreams. The simple melody filled the room, cutting through the murmurs of the departing guests. Its uncomplicated beauty stood in stark contrast to the opulence surrounding it. Lawrence Chen paused at the door. Then slowly he turned back. Elena didn't notice. She was lost in the music now, adding her own embellishments to the folk song, letting it build and breathe. Without planning it, her left hand began adding a counter-melody, harmonizing with the right in a way she'd never played before. The music poured out of her, not from practiced fingers but from some deeper place that had remained untouched by her failure and fear. One by one, the guests who had been heading for the exit stopped to listen. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Even the servers froze with their trays, caught in the spell of the unexpected music. Blackwell stood perfectly still, his expression shifting from surprise to something less definable as he watched Elena transform before his eyes. The rigid, frightened server was gone. In her place was an artist lost in creation. The folk song melded seamlessly into something else, a piece of her own making that borrowed elements from classical training but followed no rules but her own. Her fingers danced across the keys with growing confidence, no longer fighting the instrument but partnering with it. Lawrence Chen walked slowly back toward Blackwell, his eyes never leaving the young woman at the piano. "Who is she?" he asked quietly. Blackwell's gaze remained fixed on Elena. "Someone who just remembered who she really is," he answered. As the music swelled and filled every corner of the ballroom, Something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. The tension that had hung in the air all evening began to dissolve, replaced by something rarer in these circles of power and wealth, authentic emotion. And Elena played on, unaware that she was no longer just fulfilling a desperate bargain, but beginning to change the course of everything that would follow. The music flowed through Elena like a river finding its path after a drought. Her fingers moved with growing confidence across the keys, each note more assured than the last. The simple folk melody her grandmother had taught her had evolved into something entirely her own, part memory, part discovery. The room had fallen completely silent except for the piano. Even the staff had stopped to listen, trays balanced forgotten in their hands. Elena remained unaware of the effect she was having, lost in the private world between herself and the music. Lawrence Chen stood transfixed halfway between the exit and Blackwell's table. His earlier dismissiveness had given way to genuine surprise. He wasn't alone. Around the ballroom, guests who had been checking their watches or scrolling through phones now gave their full attention to the young woman in the server's uniform whose music told a story without words. At his table, Blackwell watched with an intensity that went beyond his initial calculation. There was something unexpected happening, something he hadn't factored into his impromptu business decision. The music wasn't just pleasant background or technical showmanship. It was authentic in a way rarely found in the carefully curated world he inhabited. Elena's eyes remained closed as her hands found their way across the keyboard. The cramping in her fingers had disappeared, replaced by a fluidity she thought she'd lost forever. The melody shifted, incorporating elements of the classical pieces that had once been her life's focus, but transformed through the filter of the simple folk song at its core, complexity serving emotion rather than the other way around. In her mind, she was no longer in the glittering ballroom but back in the small apartment where she'd grown up, her grandmother humming along as she played. The memory was so vivid she could almost smell the cinnamon tea they always shared during practice sessions. "Look at their faces," her grandmother used to say. "When you play for an audience someday, look at their faces. That's how you'll know if you've given them something real." Elena opened her eyes. What she saw nearly made her fingers stumble again. The room had completely transformed. The polite disinterest and social masks of the wealthy crowd had fallen away. Some guests had tears in their eyes. Others wore expressions of wonder or nostalgia, as if her music had unlocked forgotten memories of their own. Near the back, Miguel and the other servers watched with undisguised pride, as if her performance belonged to them too. The event coordinator stood with his mouth slightly open, his earlier panic replaced by astonishment. And then there was Blackwell. His face had changed in a way she couldn't quite define, the calculating hardness softened by something that looked almost like recognition. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment something passed between them, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. He nodded once, slightly, and Elena felt herself nod back before returning to the music. The melody began to build toward something bigger now. Her left hand added deeper notes, creating a foundation that allowed her right to soar higher. She was no longer thinking about what came next. Her hand simply knew. The music had its own life now, and she was as much its instrument as the piano was hers. Lawrence Chen walked slowly back to Blackwell's table and leaned down to speak in his ear. Blackwell listened, then replied without taking his eyes off Elena. Chen nodded and took his seat again, pulling his phone out and typing something quickly. Elena felt a strange power flowing through her. Not the power of control or domination that filled boardrooms and business deals, but something more elemental. The power to connect, to make people feel. For so long, she had been afraid of this very thing, afraid of what happened when you opened yourself to others through music, afraid of the vulnerability and the possibility of failure. But now, with her fingers dancing across the keys and her heart wide open, she understood that the fear had been a prison of her own making. The true failure would have been never trying again, never feeling this alive. The folk melody returned but transformed through its journey, stronger, more complex, yet still true to its origins. Like herself, Elena thought. Still the girl who learned at her grandmother's side but changed by experience, both good and bad. As she approached what felt like the natural conclusion of the piece, Elena made a decision. Her hands shifted position slightly, and the opening notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata emerged again, the piece she had fumbled earlier. But this time she didn't play it as written. She incorporated it into her own creation, letting the famous melody intertwine with her grandmother's folk song. The two pieces shouldn't have worked together, one the work of a German master, the other a simple tune from her grandmother's village. Yet somehow they complemented each other perfectly, like two stories being told simultaneously, each enhancing the other. Elena's breath came easier now, her body relaxed yet energized. This was what had been missing 3 years ago at the competition. She had been playing for the judges then, for the scholarship, for a future mapped out by expectations. Now she played for herself for the pure joy of creation. The difference was everything. Across the room she noticed Blackwell watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Whatever game he'd been playing when he forced her to the piano had clearly changed. He looked almost shaken, as if he'd expected one outcome and encountered something entirely different. Lawrence Chen was now on his second phone call, speaking quietly but intensely, his eyes never leaving Elena. Other guests had taken out their phones too, not to check emails or messages, but to record her performance. Elena felt a momentary panic at being recorded, but then let it go. Let them capture this moment. Let them remember that sometimes beauty comes from unexpected places, from a waitress in a uniform instead of a performer in a gown, from failure and recovery instead of flawless execution. The music began to wind toward its conclusion. Elena didn't plan it, but her hands found their way back to the simple beginning of her grandmother's folk song. The journey completed its circle, returning home but forever changed by where it had been. As the final notes hung in the air, Elena let her hands rest gently on the keys. The silence that followed was different from the awkward one earlier. This was a silence full of held breath and suspended time, as if no one wanted to break the spell. Then, like a wave, applause erupted across the ballroom, not the polite, obligatory kind that had greeted her arrival at the piano, but genuine, spontaneous appreciation. People rose to their feet, faces alive with emotion. Elena sat stunned by the response. 3 years of avoiding pianos, of working double shifts and trying to forget what music had once meant to her, and now this moment that felt like stepping into sunlight after a long darkness. The event coordinator rushed forward, beaming. That was incredible. Absolutely incredible. Where have you been hiding this talent? Before she could answer, she felt a presence beside her. Blackwell had approached the piano, his tall figure casting a shadow over the keys. Up close, Elena could see something had shifted in his eyes, the coldness replaced by a complexity she hadn't noticed before. Well, he said quietly, so only she could hear. It seems we both underestimated you. Elena met his gaze steadily. I didn't do it for you. No, he agreed, surprising her. You didn't. That's precisely why it worked. Lawrence Chen appeared at Blackwell's side, extending his hand to Elena. Ms. Ramirez, that was extraordinary. Truly extraordinary. He shot a glance at Blackwell. Richard didn't mention you'd be performing tonight. An unexpected addition to the program, Blackwell said smoothly. Chen nodded, a new respect in his eyes as he looked at Elena. Sometimes the unexpected is exactly what's needed. He handed her a business card. I'd like to discuss something with you when you have a moment. Elena took the card automatically, still processing what had just happened. As Chen walked away, she turned to Blackwell. Your investor seems to have changed his mind. A hint of a smile touched Blackwell's lips. About several things, it seems. He studied her for a moment. I made you a promise about your grandmother's medical expenses. Yes, you did. Elena's voice was firm now, the timidity from earlier gone. And I expect you to keep it. I'm a man of my word, Ms. Ramirez. But I think we both know that what just happened here was worth considerably more than what we originally discussed. Elena tensed, wondering if he was about to change the terms of their deal. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. Your grandmother's treatment will be covered in full, but I'd like to discuss another proposition with you if you're willing. Before Elena could respond, Miguel rushed up to her, grinning from ear to ear. Elena, that was amazing. People are asking about you. They want to know where you studied, if you perform regularly. He lowered his voice. The manager said you're officially off duty for the rest of the night. You're a guest now. Elena blinked in surprise. She looked down at her server's uniform. then back at the crowd of elegantly dressed people watching her with newfound interest. "I should check on my grandmother," she said, suddenly needing to ground herself in what mattered most. Blackwell nodded. "Of course. But first," he handed her a check, already filled out and signed. Elena looked at the amount and gasped. It was far more than they had discussed, enough to cover not just current treatments but future care as well. "Why?" she asked simply. Blackwell considered her question for a moment before answering. "Let's just say you reminded me of something I'd forgotten." He glanced around the transformed ballroom. "Sometimes we all need that." As Elena stood, still holding the check, she felt lighter somehow, as if by reconnecting with the music she had reclaimed a missing piece of herself. Whatever came next, she knew with certainty that she wouldn't be running from pianos anymore. And for the first time in 3 years, that thought filled her not with dread but with possibility. Elena clutched the check in her hand as she rode the bus home, still wearing her server's uniform. The events of the night played through her mind like a dream. Her fear at the piano, the failed first attempt, the moment everything changed when she saw her grandmother's photograph. And now this check with its life-changing amount. The bus rumbled through the quiet streets. At this late hour, only a few passengers remained. Night shift workers heading home or starting their day depending on which direction life was taking them. Elena felt like she was moving in both directions at once, returning to something she'd lost while heading towards something entirely new. She checked her phone again. 3 missed calls from the event coordinator, a text from Miguel full of exclamation points, and a message from a number she didn't recognize that simply read, "Call when you're ready to discuss the future." R. Blackwell, the future. Such a simple word for something that had seemed so limited just hours before. When the bus reached her stop, Elena stepped off into the cool night air. Their apartment building stood 5 stories tall, the brick facade crumbling in places but still solid. She had often thought it resembled her grandmother, worn by time but unbreakable at the core. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step carrying the weight of possibility. What would she tell her grandmother? How could she explain what had happened tonight? The music returning, the offer, the money that would cover the treatments they couldn't afford. Elena paused outside their door, key in hand. Inside, her grandmother would likely be asleep, the small nightlight by her bed casting just enough glow for her to see her medicine bottles if she woke in pain. For a moment, Elena just breathed, preparing herself to re-enter her normal life with this new reality tucked in her pocket. She opened the door quietly. "You're late," came her grandmother's voice from the small living room, startling her. Rosa Ramirez sat in her favorite chair by the window, a thin blanket across her lap despite the warmth of the evening. "I was worried." "Abuela, you should be in bed," Elena said, dropping her bag and rushing to her grandmother's side. The older woman's face was drawn with fatigue, but her eyes remained sharp. "Something happened," Rosa said, studying her granddaughter's face. "I can see it in your eyes. Tell me." Elena knelt beside the chair, taking her grandmother's thin hands in hers. "I played tonight, Abuela." "I played the piano again." Rosa's eyes widened. "At the hotel, how?" Elena told her everything. The missing pianist, Blackwell's ultimatum, the failed attempt, and then the moment when she found the old folk song again. As she spoke, her grandmother's expression shifted from concern to wonder. "I knew the music was still in you," Rosa said softly when Elena finished. "It was just waiting." Elena pulled the check from her pocket and showed it to her grandmother. Rosa's hand trembled as she took it, her eyes widening at the amount. "This man, this Blackwell, he gave you this for playing one song?" Elena nodded. "He said it was to cover your treatments." "All of them." She hesitated. "But I think there's more to it. He wants to meet, to discuss what he called another proposition." Rosa handed the check back, her expression thoughtful. "And will you meet him?" "I don't know," Elena admitted. "Part of me doesn't trust him. The way he forced me to play, using you as leverage." She shook her head. "But another part of me is curious," Rosa finished for her. "Because he gave you back something you thought was lost." Elena looked up at her grandmother, surprised by her perception. "Yes." Rosa shifted in her chair, wincing slightly at the movement. The cancer had taken so much from her already. Weight, strength, the ability to move without pain. But it hadn't touched her spirit or her mind. "Life gives us teachers in strange packages sometimes, Nina." she said. Some teach with kindness, others with difficulty. But we can learn from both. Elena considered her grandmother's words. He's not a good man, abuela. Perhaps not, Rosa agreed. Or perhaps he is a good man who has forgotten how to show it. Either way, the question is not about him. It's about you. What do you want now that music has found you again? Elena hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead. For 3 years, her world had narrowed to practical concerns. Rent, bills, her grandmother's medication. Dreams had seemed like luxuries they couldn't afford. I want to play, she said simply, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. But I also want to help you get better. Rosa reached out to stroke Elena's hair just as she had when Elena was a child. Then do both. Start with this man's offer. Listen to what he has to say. You can always walk away. Elena nodded, leaning into her grandmother's touch. I'll call him tomorrow. Good, Rosa said. Now help an old woman to bed. These bones aren't what they used to be. The next morning, Elena called the number Blackwell had left. To her surprise, he answered immediately. Ms. Ramirez, he said, his voice as precise as she remembered. I was hoping to hear from you. I want to know what this proposition is, Elena said, skipping any pleasantries. She sat at their small kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold beside her. Her grandmother was still asleep, the treatments leaving her exhausted most mornings. Straight to business. I appreciate that. There was a hint of approval in Blackwell's voice. What would you say to becoming the artistic director for a new community music program? Full salary, benefits, and complete creative control. Elena nearly dropped the phone. What are you talking about? What community music program? The one I'm founding. Blackwell replied as if it were obvious. The Ramirez Music Foundation. Named after your grandmother. Elena's mind raced, trying to process what she was hearing. Why would you do this? You don't even know me. There was a pause on the line. When Blackwell spoke again, his voice had lost some of its businesslike edge. I've been in rooms with world-class musicians, Ms. Ramirez. I've attended private concerts by renowned pianists. None of them did what you did last night, not just play notes, but change the feeling of an entire room. Elena remained silent, unsure how to respond to the unexpected sincerity. Blackwell continued. Lawrence Chen has agreed to be the primary backer. He was quite impressed. Said you reminded him of his mother, who apparently taught music in rural China before the Cultural Revolution forced her to stop. I don't understand what you want from me, Elena said finally. I want you to do for others what you did for that room last night, Blackwell replied, particularly for young people who might not otherwise have the chance to discover music. Elena thought of the years her grandmother had worked extra hours cleaning houses to pay for her piano lessons. How many children never got that chance? And what do you get out of this? She asked, still cautious. Another pause. Let's just say I'm diversifying my investments. Into community music programs? Elena couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. Into remembering why we do what we do, Blackwell said, his tone uncharacteristically reflective. Business deals come and go, Ms. Ramirez, but moments like last night, those are rarer than you might think. Elena looked around their small apartment, at the stack of medical bills on the counter, at her grandmother's worn robe hanging by the bathroom door, at the empty space in the corner where her keyboard used to stand before they had to sell it for rent money. I'd need to be able to care for my grandmother, she said. Her health comes first. Of course, Blackwell agreed immediately. The position includes premium health insurance that would cover both of you, and the foundation would be based here in the city so you wouldn't need to relocate. It sounded too good to be true. Elena's natural wariness surfaced again. Why me? There must be dozens of musicians more qualified. Qualification isn't just about technique or training, Blackwell said. It's about understanding what music can do. You know what it means to lose music and find it again. That's a perspective worth sharing. Elena was silent for a long moment, thinking. Through the thin wall, she could hear her grandmother stirring, the familiar sounds of her morning routine. Can I think about it? She asked finally. Take all the time you need, Blackwell replied. The offer stands. And Ms. Ramirez? Regardless of your decision, your grandmother's medical expenses are covered. That was our deal. After they hung up, Elena sat at the kitchen table, turning her coffee mug in circles. The world had shifted beneath her feet, possibilities opening where before there had been only walls. Her grandmother appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but with more energy than she'd shown in weeks. Who were you talking to so early? she asked, making her way to the table. Elena poured her a cup of tea, adding the honey her grandmother preferred. Richard Blackwell. He offered me a job. Rosa's eyebrows rose as Elena explained the proposal. When she finished, her grandmother sat back in her chair, a smile spreading across her tired face. So, Rosa said, what will you tell him? Elena looked at her grandmother, the woman who had taught her to play, who had believed in her even when she stopped believing in herself. She thought of the piano at the hotel, how it had felt to let the music flow through her again after so long. I think, Elena said slowly, I'm going to say yes. Rosa reached across the table to squeeze her granddaughter's hand. The music always knew you would come back to it, Nina. It was just waiting for you to be ready. Outside their window, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow across the small kitchen. A new day, Elena thought. A new beginning. 6 months passed like a dream. Elena stood in the newly renovated community center, watching as workers installed the final piano, a gleaming grand for the main performance hall. 5 other rooms already contained upright pianos, each one tuned and ready for the students who would soon fill these spaces. The Ramirez Music Foundation was no longer just an idea, but a reality of brick and wood and strings and keys. Sometimes Elena still couldn't believe it. She ran her hand along the smooth wooden rail that had been installed for her grandmother, who insisted on touring the facility despite her doctor's concerns about her energy levels. It's beautiful, came a voice behind her. Elena turned to see Rosa making her way slowly into the hall, leaning on her walker but moving with more strength than she had shown in months. The experimental treatments Blackwell had arranged were working. Not a cure, the doctors cautioned, but a significant improvement that had given Rosa back some of the vitality cancer had stolen. Careful, Abuela, Elena said, rushing to her grandmother's side. You're supposed to save your energy for the opening ceremony. Rosa waved away her concern with a flick of her wrist, a gesture so familiar it made Elena smile. I've been saving my energy for 72 years. It's time to spend some of it. Elena helped her grandmother to a seat near the piano. Rosa's eyes swept the room with approval. He really did it, she said. That hard man of yours kept his word. He's not my hard man, Elena corrected automatically, though without the defensive edge that would have been there months ago. Rosa smiled knowingly but said nothing. In truth, Elena's relationship with Richard Blackwell had evolved in ways she never expected. What began as a business arrangement had gradually shifted into something more complex. Not quite friendship, but a mutual respect built on their shared passion for what music could do. Blackwell had surprised her with his commitment to the foundation. She had expected him to write checks and make appearances at donor events. Instead, he had immersed himself in the details, from the acoustics of the practice rooms to the scholarship program that would allow children from the city's poorest neighborhoods to study for free. Ms. Ramirez. As if summoned by her thoughts, Blackwell appeared in the doorway. Unlike their first meeting, when his tailored suit had created a barrier between their worlds, today he wore a simple button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His usual formality softened. Mr. Blackwell, she acknowledged, still maintaining some professional distance in her grandmother's presence. We were just admiring your handiwork. Our handiwork, he corrected, crossing to shake Rosa's hand. Mrs. Ramirez, you're looking well. Well enough to see my granddaughter finally using her gifts again, Rosa replied, studying him with the directness that was her trademark. That is thanks to you, I think. Blackwell shook his head. The gift was always hers. I just provided an opportunity. An opportunity that cost several $1 million, Elena pointed out dryly. A hint of the old sharpness returned to Blackwell's expression. An investment. Ah, Rosa said with a smile. And what return do you expect on this particular investment, Mr. Blackwell? The question hung in the air. Elena had wondered the same thing many times over the past months. Despite his involvement, Blackwell had never fully explained his motives beyond vague references to community impact and cultural development. Blackwell considered his answer carefully. When I was 10, he said finally, my mother used her last savings to buy me piano lessons. 6 months later, she became ill. The lessons stopped. The piano was sold. His voice remained even, but Elena noticed his hands, always so controlled, flex slightly at his sides. Some opportunities once lost don't come again. The simple story explained so much. His recognition of her talent that night at the gala, his insistence that she play again, his commitment to the foundation. Elena saw him differently in that moment, not as the calculating billionaire who had manipulated her, but as someone who understood exactly what music could mean in a life. "Well," Rosa said after a moment, reaching for her walker, "I should rest before the ceremony. Elena, help an old woman to the office, please." As Elena helped her grandmother up, Rosa paused beside Blackwell. "You know," she said quietly, "it's never too late to start again." When they were alone, Elena returned to find Blackwell standing by the grand piano, his fingers hovering just above the keys without touching them. "Do you still play?" she asked. He withdrew his hand. "No." Elena moved to the bench and sat down. "My grandmother says everyone can play. It's just a matter of finding the right song." She played a simple C major scale. "Try." "I'm not here to play," Blackwell said stiffly. "The donors will be arriving in an hour. We should review the program." Elena continued playing, adding chords to the basic scale. 5 minutes. Then we'll be all business again." Something in her tone must have reached him. After a moment's hesitation, Blackwell sat beside her on the bench. The proximity was strange after months of careful professional distance. "One hand," Elena guided. "Just 5 notes. Like this." She demonstrated the beginning of the simple folk tune her grandmother had taught her, the same one that had broken through her fear at the gala. Slowly, awkwardly, Blackwell placed his fingers on the keys and tried to mimic the pattern. His timing was off, his touch too heavy, but the notes were recognizable. "Not terrible," Elena said with a small smile. "For a beginner." Blackwell's expression remained serious. "I'm many things, Ms. Ramirez. A musician isn't one of them." "No," she agreed. "But you've made it possible for hundreds of children to discover if they might be." She nodded toward the windows, where outside the neighborhood spread in all directions. Apartments, small businesses, schools. Some of them might never have found out otherwise. Blackwell followed her gaze. "Like you almost didn't, and like you didn't," she added softly. He stood abruptly. "We should prepare for the donors." Elena let him retreat behind his professional mask, understanding now that some walls took longer to come down than others. But a beginning had been made. The opening ceremony exceeded all expectations. Children from the neighborhood filled the front rows, their eyes wide as Elena played for them. Parents who had worked extra shifts to be there watched with pride and hope. Donors applauded at all the right moments. Local news captured it all. But the moment Elena would remember most came afterward, when most guests had departed. She found her grandmother in a practice room with a young girl around 8 years old. Rosa was guiding the child's small hands over the keys, teaching her the same folk song she had taught Elena all those years ago. "Like this," Rosa was saying. "Don't worry about making mistakes. Music lives in the trying." Elena leaned against the doorframe, watching them. Behind her, she sensed rather than heard Blackwell approach. "She'll make an excellent teacher," he said quietly, observing Rosa and the child. "She already is," Elena replied. "She taught me everything important." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the impromptu lesson unfold. The child's face lit up when she managed to play a few notes correctly, and Rosa beamed with the particular joy of sharing something precious. "This is it, isn't it?" Blackwell said after a moment. "The return on investment," Elena nodded. "Worth every penny?" For the first time since she'd known him, Blackwell smiled without reservation. Beyond calculation. In the practice room, more children had gathered around Rosa and the piano, each eager for their turn. Their voices filled the space with questions and laughter. Outside, the sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in colors as varied and beautiful as music itself. Elena thought about the path that had brought her here, from fear to renewal, from silence to song. How one moment at a piano had changed everything. How sometimes the notes we're most afraid to play become the beginning of our finest music. "Ready for tomorrow?" Blackwell asked as they watched the children take turns at the piano. Tomorrow would bring the first official classes, the true beginning of what they'd built together. Elena smiled, feeling the future unfold before her like a melody waiting to be played. "Ready?"